I've been working here at this museum for about 15 years. And your teacher has asked me to try to make you laugh about Lewis and Clark as much as possible in the next 20 minutes. So I hope you'll enjoy this program, which is a series of stories about funny mistakes that were made on the Lewis and Clark expedition. The reason I'm telling you these stories is not just to make you laugh, but also to teach you a lesson about yourself. I'm going to present Lewis and Clark as a bunch of mistake makers who also made history. And at the end, I'm going to remind you that you are a mistake maker. You probably knew that. Who will make history? That's the most important part. You are the next history makers. You are the next Lewis and Clark. You are the next, perhaps, people who will go to Mars or do other things that are written about in history. You don't have any choice in the matter. People don't choose to make history. We all do it. It's something that we do simply by living our lives. The only choice you have is what kind of history is your generation going to make while you make mistakes. So I want to tell you some stories about Lewis and Clark's mistakes, and I hope you see a little bit of yourself in these stories. The mistakes of the Lewis and Clark expedition began really early on in the expedition, and they are too numerous to mention. But as you probably know, there was these two people in charge, Captain Lewis and William Clark, and they assembled a group of 31 other people, including Sacagawea, Yor, Pomp, and about 29 other random dudes. And they went across the country and back 200 years ago. The first story I have for you actually happens towards the end of the expedition. I'm gonna jump to the end first. And if you have your map on you, this part of the expedition, if you find the Great Falls of the Missouri on your map, both of these stories that I'm going to tell you happen right around that area. And you see right above the Great Falls of the Missouri, there's kind of a little loop of a dotted line that goes up toward the Canadian border. That's where our story takes place.
Oh.
At this point in the expedition, Lewis and Clark had split up. Clark took half the folks down the Yellowstone River, and Lewis took the other half along the Missouri River, and they took this little side trip to see just how far north the Louisiana Purchase went. This side trip would take them into the territory of the Blackfoot Indians. The Blackfoot Indians had lived up there on the Canadian border for about 10,000 years. For 10,000 years, they had earned themselves a reputation of fiercely defending their homeland. Luckily, Lewis knew about this. Jefferson had warned him about the Blackfoot. He said, I want you to go through Blackfoot territory and make me a map. But I don't want you to get in any fights with the Blackfoot. And in fact, you should try to avoid the Blackfoot tribe at all costs, because they are known to attack without warning if they sense invaders in their territory. So they were basically sneaking through Blackfoot territory, Lewis and half of the party. And this was a dangerous part in the expedition. They had to stay together at all times, whenever possible. There was only one time each day that they were allowed to split up. That happened at night when somebody had to go hunting to get dinner. This was such a dangerous job to go out away from the main party and go hunting that they took turns. And each night it was two different people who were chosen to go hunting. On the night where the story takes place, it was Lewis, the boss, and Cruzette, who had been chosen to go hunting. You guys know, by a raise of your hand, you guys know one thing about Cruzette? Oh, good. Okay, let's start in the back. What's one thing you know about Cruzette? He played the fiddle. Does anybody know something different about Cruzette way in the back? Okay, wait for it though. Don't give away my story. Does anybody have anything else that hasn't been mentioned already that does not have to do with Lewis's accident? Oh, it's still right there. Yeah.
Before I die,
He had a blind eye. I was hoping somebody would say that. So one eye was missing. The other eye, he had not very good vision. So he's like this half-blind guy. He happened to be a French-Canadian guy. He was also the only person on the expedition who did not speak English. He was hired for his geography knowledge, not his skill with a weapon. But like everybody else, he took his turn, and when it was his turn to go hunting, he and Lewis grabbed 2 of the very best rifles that they carried with them. These were sniper rifles that Lewis had made at the beginning of the expedition. He had gone to a gun factory and he had them make these special rifles just for the trip. They were the only rifles in the country that were exactly like that. And one of the special things about these rifles is that they had a special kind of bullet. This is one of them right here. Most bullets back then were size 50 or 50 caliber. But Lewis, for the first time, decided to try a 54 caliber bullet. It was a little bit bigger. It looks pretty much the same. But what I want you to remember for now is it was a special size bullet used only by Lewis and Clark. Can you guys remember 54 for the next 10 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. So, Lewis and Cruzette grab the sniper rifles and they go out away from the main party into Blackfoot territory to go hunting, to get dinner quietly and come back. They are sneaking through some really thick woods and they get separated. Lewis was sneaking up a little faster. Cruzette was getting left behind. And they started to hear some noise up ahead of them. And they were hoping it would be some deer or elk and not a bunch of Blackfoot warriors. And at one point, Cruzette, even though he was falling behind, he could see some movement up ahead of him. He could see little pieces and parts, glimpses of a herd of elk through small gaps in the big bushes and trees that was blocking his view. So he's kind of squinting in between the trees with his one good eye, looking to see if he's got a shot. And he sees this patch of elk skin pause right in a gap between 2 trees. He figured if he could shoot between the 2 trees and hit the elk skin, they'd all have dinner and be able to go back to safety. So he raised his rifle to his one good eye, and he aimed it as best he could at the tiny patch of elk skin. He squeezed the trigger and boom! Meanwhile, 100 yards in front of him was Captain Lewis. Captain Lewis was also looking at some elk through gaps in the bushes. And he also saw where he had a shot on an elk. So he raised his rifle and he prepared to fire. But before he could squeeze the trigger, he heard a loud boom from behind him, followed by searing hot pain in his butt. He looked back to realize that he had one of the weirdest wounds in all of American history. Because that bullet had entered his right butt cheek, right about where my pocket corner is right there. It went all the way through the right butt cheek, made a brief appearance in the middle before entering the left butt cheek and cutting all the way across it, becoming lodged in his pants on the other side, with a total of at least 4 holes in Lewis's butt. And although he was seriously injured, his next thought was for his friend and companion, Pierre Cruzette. He screamed, "Pierre Cruzette, are you back there?" And although Cruzette was just 100 yards back with a smoking gun in his hand, he said nothing. He ducked down and hid in the bushes. Lewis's mind was racing. He was trying to figure out what was happening. And then he remembered Jefferson and Jefferson's warning about the Blackfoot and how the Blackfoot were known to attack without warning. This was obviously an Indian attack. Lewis had to go warn everybody. So he held his rifle under one arm, grabbed a butt cheek in each hand, and ran back to camp as fast as he could, where he told the guys there, "Look at my butt." It was the Indians, and they've got Cruzette. So they all loaded their rifles, and they headed back out into the woods to try to find these Indian attackers and save their friend Pierre Cruzette. They searched high and low, but could find no sign of any Indian attackers. During the search, Lewis was losing blood, and he began to feel woozy. So he grabbed onto the shoulder of the closest sergeant, happened to be Sergeant Patrick Gass, and he said, "Gass, take me back to camp and help me with my butt. So they kind of start staggering back towards camp while everybody else continues to search for the Blackfoot attackers. Back at camp, it's all Lewis can do to grab onto the side of one of the boats, bend over, and he says to Patrick Gass, he says, "Patrick, would you please remove my pants and take a close look at my butt?" So Patrick Gass kind of get down on one knee, and he turned his head to one side, and he started to undo Lewis's pants.
Oh God, that's what I do.
Meanwhile, out in the woods, they're all looking for the Indian attackers, but the only person they find out there is Pierre Cruzette. Cruzette denies knowing anything about the whole deal, and they decide to go check on the captain. And it just so happens that they arrive back in camp at the exact moment that Patrick Gass pulls off Lewis's pants. Whoosh!
Oh!
And as he does, out drops the bullet. And when the bullet hit the ground, they all looked at it, and they looked at Cruzette. And they looked at it, and they looked at Cruzette. And they looked at it, and they could tell by looking just what size it was. What size was it? 54. It was not a bullet of the Blackfoot Indians. It was a Lewis and Clark bullet. They knew at that moment that a serious mistake had been made. That Cruzette had not been shooting at an elk, that he had shot the leader of the expedition. He had shot one of the most accomplished military minds of a generation. And they couldn't stop the bleeding. It looked like Lewis was going to die right then and there. You might think that Lewis would order Cruzette to be punished somehow. He could have done that. They punished people in violent ways back in the days of Lewis and Clark. But Lewis stopped acting like a captain in the army for just one moment, and he started acting like a captain of a team. He knew that Cruzette was on his team, that Cruzette was a team player, that he had just made a mistake when he shot him in the woods. And so Cruzette was forgiven rather than punished. This is not only a funny example of a near-death experience on Lewis's part, but also a good glimpse into just what Lewis was like.